These are my people, the Somalis. We are unique in Africa because we are one nation, united by one language, one culture, and one religion, Islam. We are known as the Irish of Africa because we have always been ready to fight the colonial powers who have divided our nation and denied us our wish for an independent Somali state. My father was born in the Haud region of Western Somalia, in what was and still is Ethiopian Somaliland. He was a Somali. My name is Hussein Mohammed Adam. I was born in Arusha, northern Tanzania, and I am a Somali. It is this deep personal belief in belonging to the Somali nation, handed down from father to son, which has driven our people to fight against impossible odds, to endure defeat, only to fight again and again and again.
هدي وساكمي وايا نعانيه هش صوبان صدح قور ولسايون كسريقة إيدا هدو ساكمي وايا سمركي ركت جوغية سوقبان وقلا هدو ساكمي وايا سيدي عدميد بان سلسي سبقا وقوبتشا هدي وساكمي وايا نقبر سورة وناكسن بان سورة وقرهرا هدي وساكمي وايا حولقوني وصوفية صددان كلها هدو ساكمي وايا نسيد وموت إيا موت إيا صلان تنبدية هدي وساكمي وايا نصلاة دان للبا حمر سول المدو يسلين كان عسكدا سلوب هوتا كجوكتو أيان سررتا كنفتا مركز سوسلي مايو إيقو ساكن نقدا
In this film, I want to try to explain to you what's happening in my country, how we are trying to sort out problems created many years ago, how a nation of 5 million people is trying to take care of 1 million refugees who have nowhere else to go, and what's like for a small third world country to try to live with the superpowers, and also how we are trying to transform the Somali nation into a modern African state. Because this film is a personal viewpoint, I would like to share with you my own hopes for my country's future and that of the Horn of Africa. For centuries, our capital Mogadishu was a major trading port and a center for Islamic learning. But it has known domination by both the Italian and British empires. We have learned to live with their symbols of past triumph, but we have yet to find a way to live with the last empire in Africa, the Ethiopian. They were the only African rulers allowed to import guns from their European allies, who also gave them a free hand to extend the Ethiopian empire by conquest. My friend Abdul Majid Hussein was born and brought up in Ethiopian Somaliland.
In these areas, what has happened was the setting up, as well as in the rest, of garrison towns, military garrisons, like the Roman colons of the former days, and whereby from time to time tribute collecting expeditions would be sent out. And in the Somali areas, this would mean the looting of cattle and camels and any other herds that they had. In the case of the other settled agriculturalists, this would be tribute collected in the form of grain, and in some areas, in fact, tribute collected in the form of slaves.
In Somalia, there is always a limit to submission. In 1899, the Sayyid Mohammed Abdallah Hassan proclaimed a jihad, a holy war to regain our independence and reunite our dismembered nation. For 20 years, his army of dervishes, masters of guerrilla warfare, fought the armies of 3 empires, the British, the Italians, and the Ethiopians. His final defeat made military history when the Royal Air Force carried out their first aerial bombardment of his fortress at Taleh, and our dream of an independent Somali nation lay in ruins. The man who has written the history of Somalia is Professor I.M. Lewis.
Well, modern Somali nationalism really got going immediately after the Second World War, when the whole area, the whole of the Horn of Africa virtually, was under British military administration. The Somalis as a people have consistently sought to form a state based on the principle of self-determination applied to them, i.e. on the principle of, in effect, Somali self-determination. And, of course, while the British were administering the area, the British Foreign Secretary of the day, Ernest Bevin, in 1946, launched his famous plan to create a state on the basis of Somali nationhood, and that this should be probably a United Nations Trust territory administered by Britain. The proposals were opposed by America, which was being lobbied strongly by Ethiopia, and which had interests in establishing military facilities, American military facilities, in Ethiopia. Once the Ethiopian area, what is ethnically Western Somalia, was finally surrendered to the Ethiopians by the British, this created a very lively nationalist movement in the British Somaliland Protectorate. And these two movements, the one in the north and the one in the south associated with the Somali Youth League, got together and sought to form a unitary state at independence in 1960, which of course is what happened.
Africa, 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 Africa.
The Somali Republic celebrated its independence in July 1960. But for many of our people in the Somali nation, there was little to celebrate. Those living inside the border of Kenya were still under the British flag. The Somalis in Djibouti were still part of the French Empire. And of course, Western Somaliland was still an Ethiopian colony ruled by Emperor Haile Selassie. The frustration at not being allowed to join our independent Somali Republic caused renewed struggles throughout the rest of the Somali nation. My friend Abdul Majid Hussein was part of that struggle.
And that had its also counterparts with a lot of people in, that is Somalis in Ethiopian Somaliland or Western Somaliland, also wanting at least some form of autonomy, or if not, also wanting to join the Somali Republic. This was put down by force, and many Somalis, for the first time in large numbers, moved or went into exile into the Somali Republic.
Our brothers from Ethiopian Somaliland were warmly welcomed into our new republic. Many were highly qualified people who had been prevented from working in their chosen profession simply because they were Somali. Almost as soon as they arrived, the exiles began to put pressure on the Somali government to help them liberate their homeland.
People don't simply just rise up and say we are going to secede from these people for nothing. They would do so if they don't have equality, if they are oppressed, if they are continuously faced, with injustice. I take the example on a very simpler level, let's say between a man and a woman, a husband and wife relationship. If the wife, as happens, is the case in most countries around the world, gets, the bad side of that relationship, she's beaten in some cases, and she's oppressed in one way or another, and in this case, some of our African brothers and others who have the same views around the world would say is is tantamount to telling the wives who are, let's say, beaten up by, their husbands, that they should tolerate this, that family union should stay at all costs, and that they shouldn't have the right to divorce.
The headquarters for the Western Somalia Liberation Front was established in Mogadishu, and the guerrilla war, which had been started by the Said Mohammed Abdallah Hassan nearly 100 years ago, continued with increasing success. But it nearly resulted in the destruction of our new republic, for Emperor Haile Selassie saw this renewed conflict as a golden opportunity to extend his empire over all the Horn of Africa. Haile Selassie decided to strike at the new republic, to cut off their support to the freedom fighters, and to convince the world that this was merely a border war between two independent states and not a fight for independence by the people of Western Somaliland against the last empire in the Horn. In exchange for a military base in Eritrea, Ethiopia was able to receive 60% of all American military aid to Africa, plus United States advisors to train the Imperial Army and Air Force. The war along our borders in 1964 was short but brutal. Somalia was defended by its police force, which contained the battle against vastly superior forces. But as the Said Mohammed Abdallah Hassan discovered, bravery alone is not enough against superior military technology. The then pro-West civilian government of Somalia, did it try to obtain arms from the West?
Yes, it did, and it was offered a military aid package. But, of course, it was offered this in a situation which wasn't very favorable, because it was offered a much bigger Russian package. And since the civilian government, the civilian Somali government, was aware, all too aware, that the Western powers were in general supporting Ethiopia and also opposing Somali nationalist interests and aspirations in northern Kenya, the much larger Russian package was a much more attractive offer, which they accepted.
This is Berbera, one of the main reasons why the Soviet Union was happy to supply us with economic and military aid. It gave them access to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and most importantly, to what is considered the most strategic supply route for the West. My friend Mahmoud Issa Jama went to Moscow as part of the official Somali delegation. He remembers how they were received by the Russians.
They provided all the things that the Somali government at that period needed. In other words, training and all the necessary vehicles they wanted for the army.
Was it easier to negotiate with them?
Most of us were educated in the West, you see, and it was completely new to us to negotiate with the Russians. The Russian attitude is an aggressive attitude, you see. It's a sort of, you must accept. And this is an attitude that we never get used to it.
When it comes to question of negotiating, say, a trade or a commercial agreement, they don't give any concessionary thing whatsoever, not one iota. I mean, we were buying, for instance, petroleum from them, and we always had to buy from them not on concessionary terms, but on the prevailing international prices. At the same time, once they see that the country is not in a position to pay, they were always more than willing to reschedule those debts and postpone the payment of these things. Up to the present time, some of the loans and credits which we contracted from the Soviet Union way back in 1960 and 61, we have not yet effected their repayment period.
By the 70s, Somalia was recognized as having one of the best armies in Africa. Across the border, Emperor Haile Selassie had been overthrown, and the new Ethiopian military regime led by Colonel Mengistu was fighting desperately to keep the old empire intact. They were at war with the Tigrayans, the Oromos, the Eritreans, and with our brothers in the Western Somalia Liberation Front, who by now had won control over much of their homeland. Many of the senior officers and soldiers in our army were in fact from Western Somaliland, and they were eager to resume battle against the last empire in Africa. By September of 1977, they had combined forces with the Western Somalia Liberation Front, and at first the old dream of liberating what many consider to be the heartland of the Somali nation looked like coming true. But the Soviets who had trained our army had their own strategic plans for replacing the Americans in Ethiopia. They began by airlifting $2 billion of military aid to the new regime, then gave up all pretense of neutrality, and with 15,000 Cuban troops, masterminded the Ethiopian counteroffensive against the Somali forces, who never stood a chance. That Soviet switch created a new army for Somalia. Well over 1 million men, women and children, who having barely survived the terrors of a modern war with its tanks and jet planes, came to us in the Somali Democratic Republic for shelter, relying on the nomadic traditions of hospitality.
أحماره ودن كيجا هستيانو دمعنا إني ودن كيجا نوقت تجانو سيد خلق قوة مدح بنايا أن مدح بنانا أنا قلنا دمعنا مركان نمن كيوين الديدي وأنا سليني وكان سليني أنا يجي كحورونا أنا يا نروش ليلا يكوبو يدرس فربضان وحلفوه وطن أو يمن يو فربضان ليبي يا اليمن يو خلق فربضان أو حلفوه وروش قوتي يا ديدنا يا نلاقو دلبتي تدكي حاجة كورونا عذاب دبنا كاني حاجة سنة كارل ماتي يا ببل يا نلاقو كاني تدكي الله يجينا قبي أرواح يجينا الدليل مالك يجينا وعنا يوح قاتي كده مركا كل كي أنا صار دمنا بعد يا ديت صار
Somalia is a poor country, but what little we had, we shared. By 1980, 1 person in 4 in our country was a refugee. We didn't have anything like the resources or the trained people needed to cope with such a tidal wave of human misery. Hussein Samatar worked in Britain for many years, training nurses for their National Health Service. He returned to Somalia to help launch our new health program. But so desperate was the situation that he was sent to work in the refugee camps.
The Somalis have contributed a lot because the personnel who are doing the management of all camps are employed by the Somali government. And in the medical field, now we have 6 people here, and 5 of them are nurses and 1 sanitarian. So these 6 people, it's provided by the Somali government. And also, the teachers in the schools, they are all those teachers who were employed by the Ministry of Education. And also, we have what we call home economics here, taught by the refugees, and the teachers who are doing this job are also employed by the Somali government. So the whole total management of the whole camp, the personnel, the manpower, is from the Somali government.
The refugees in our country survive mainly on the generosity of the world aid agencies. Somalia is making its contribution by taking over the administration. This means that many of the social programs planned for our own people have had to be postponed, another casualty of the conflict. But at the moment, everyone's priority is the refugees.
I have no idea how long the refugee problem is going to exist in Somalia, but we are prepared to stay here to help deliver to the refugees the food that is brought in here by international donors. I do believe that international donors will be much more receptive to continuing to provide food for the refugees if they saw that it was going into some sort of development effort. And therefore, I would very much like to see free food discontinued and made available through Food for Work, that there be some sort of an employment scheme offered to the refugees. And the feedback I get from the chairman of the National Refugee Commission and other Somalis in responsible positions that they feel that the refugees would be very responsive to such a program. And now it's just a matter of trying to work out the mechanics.
We in Somalia actually have some experience in trying to resettle nomads. These men once roamed throughout the Somali nation with their herds of camels. The drought of '74 made them victims, and our government, wanting to give them a chance at a new life, tried to make them fishermen. But we have also discovered you can't turn a nomadic herdsman into a fisherman overnight.
They still haven't received the proper training in either fishing or the mechanics of the boats. There was a certain lack of planning, partly because it was done in a very short time. This idea came out as a consequence of the drought. And they started them out as pure collectives, which time has shown is not very conducive to fishing development, especially because the fishermen don't feel they have any responsibility for either boats or equipment, so they don't care so much, since they can get new equipment from the government.
Somalia is blessed with one of the longest coastlines in Africa, and the waters of the Indian Ocean and Red Sea could provide many of our people with a new independent way of life.
All the settlements are still completely dependent on food rations, partly from the government, but mostly through the UN World Food Program. And in my opinion, this actually is detrimental to their development, because it causes a food dependency from outside instead of being more self-sufficient. They're starting to sell the boats to the fishermen, giving them more responsibility. And it seems also in the long run they're going to cut down on the rations, so this dependency will gradually decrease. I think in the long run this might cause some flights away from the settlements. But if there's somebody who absolutely doesn't want to be a fisherman, nobody should force him. The best people will certainly stay.